What if the story we know is a lie? When Severus Snape takes his final breath in the Shrieking Shack, he expects oblivion. He does not expect to wake up. He certainly does not expect to wake up in the body of his most hated rival's son, Harry Potter, just moments before the sorting hat is placed on his head. Now, trapped as an 11-year-old boy and sorted into Gryffindor, the cynical potions master must face Albus Dumbledore's twinkling eyes, his own infuriating past self, and the clueless buffoons he's forced to call classmates. Here is part 3.
In the next instant, the man in front of me seemed to come back to his senses. He stared at me, at this small, skinny body I was currently trapped in, with absolute horror. Was he insane? It was obvious what he was thinking. He actually felt that this Potter brat resembled himself. He was hallucinating. This boy clearly looked exactly like old Potter. He had that arrogant swine's blood running through his veins, not mine. "Get out," he said suddenly, his voice dry. I looked at my own face in confusion. One moment, he had spaced out, and the next, his expression had changed drastically. Tonight's training had barely begun, and I was already being kicked out. Professor Snape, I actually took a step forward, looking straight into the man's hollow black eyes, my eyes, trying to deduce something. I would have been happy to end this torture early, but I couldn't fathom the reason for his abnormal reaction. How could I leave with any peace of mind without knowing what foolish notion had entered his head? "Get out!" His voice sounded as though he were physically suppressing something. His gaze avoided my confused look, fixing hollowly only on the top of the messy black hair on my head. It was the suppressed calm before an explosion. I knew that look well. I had worn it often enough. I frowned, but I turned and ran quickly out of the dungeon. At least I knew that at times like this, he, that is to say I, never wanted anyone present. "Poor lad, what did you do to get kicked out? The temper of the guy inside isn't good, but it's never been this bad, has it?" The Medusa on the door hissed gloatingly. "Shut up." "Wait, you can understand what I'm saying?" The snake tails in Medusa's hair stood up in surprise. "Obviously." Although I answered with a flat expression, my heart gave a violent jolt. To my own senses, the language I was speaking sounded no different from English, but what Medusa said meant that what I was speaking now was actually Parseltongue. Was this the Potter boy's Parseltongue? Before I could analyze this further, the heavy dungeon door suddenly swung open, and the black figure, my own imposing form, abruptly appeared in front of me. "You, come in." His look he shot me was complex and astonished. Although I had a sudden burning desire to retort, I remembered the current situation wasn't suitable for talking in the corridor. Obediently, I walked back inside. The heavy door slammed shut. The black figure spun around, robes billowing in that familiar way, and stared straight at me. "How can you speak Parseltongue?" His eyes were terrifyingly hollow, his voice even more strange than before. The words were almost squeezed out of his throat as he gripped my shoulders hard. I recalled the moment when I had first discovered this ability. It had truly felt like falling into an ice cave. That cold hissing sound, exactly the same as the Dark Lord's, almost dragged me back to those bloody and cruel memories. In front of so many people, I had immediately used occlumency to stop myself from subconsciously clutching my left arm. So, his reaction was not surprising, especially after his emotions had inexplicably become unstable just moments ago. "Speak." His aura grew heavier. The hand gripping my shoulder squeezed harder, and I felt as if the collarbone of this fragile body was about to snap. I could only murmur with my head down, pretending to be at a loss. According to Dumbledore, Lily had used a spell to protect the Potter boy, causing the Dark Lord's curse to rebound and destroy his body. A small fragment of his soul had attached itself to Potter. Therefore, Potter had to die in the end. The Potter family had absolutely nothing to do with the Slytherin bloodline. I could guess that it was precisely because of that small fragment of the Dark Lord's soul that this body possessed the ability to speak Parseltongue. But could I tell him these things? The boy he had spent so much effort protecting last time suddenly had to die, and there was no turning point. This simply negated the only remaining meaning of his survival. That is why, in my previous life, after handing over the memories, I could choose to die without any lingering regrets. "I don't know." So I could only murmur this again. He looked deeply into my eyes, trying to judge the veracity of my words. Then slowly, he relaxed his grip, his expression returning to his usual coldness. "I assume Mr. Potter does not wish to lose his life for certain reasons by clamoring about his special ability everywhere." I won't say anything." I pursed my lips, trying hard to make my expression look like a child making a solemn promise, as sincere as possible. Although I didn't realize it at the moment, this rare pursing of the lips combined with a cold expression, which I thought was merely serious, made me look even more like Severus Snape. Merlin, is this kid really a troll from the Potter family? And am I really that tired? Why do I keep feeling tonight that this kid has Snape blood? I saw his pupils contract. He abruptly took a step back, his mouth going dry at his own absurd conjecture. Then the door's there, that's all for tonight. He hissed, indicating I should leave. I remained silent and didn't move. I said, "Professor Snape," I suddenly interrupted him. Although I didn't know exactly what I was going to say next, I was simply in an unpleasant mood. Even if it was myself, even if he enjoyed targeting the Potter boy, did he think he could just beckon me to come and wave me away at will? And twice! What did he take me for?
Have you ever washed your hair? 10 points from Gryffindor for disrespecting a professor, the man hissed, the provocation working instantly. I didn't back down. Instead, I took a bold step forward, locking my eyes with his. I forced the corners of my mouth into a perfectly innocent, sickeningly sweet smile. Professor Snape, to thank you for your teachings during this time, I feel I must say a few words. I paused for effect. Your appearance is actually quite charming, and the shape of your nose, it's truly beautiful. It is just that your personal hygiene is somewhat lacking, which is why you look so terrible. Professor Snape, if you simply cleaned yourself up, you would surely charm many girls. How dare you? But I might be unhappy if that happened, I interrupted him smoothly, delivering the killing blow with a deadpan expression. Because even if your hair is greasy, even if you haven't bathed in days, even if your face is sallow and you enjoy scolding people, I still think you are the best. Really, I repeated, widening my eyes to look as sincere and innocent as a first-year Hufflepuff. In my eyes, you are the best. I couldn't poke my own sore spots too hard, it would be suspicious, but saying ordinary things would be ineffective. I was currently in the disadvantageous position of a student. I couldn't duel him, so I had to disgust him. I knew exactly what I hated the most. I knew exactly how to make myself vomit. I hated people commenting on my appearance because I knew the truth. I was plain, bordering on ugly. I especially loathed comments about my nose. The echoes of James Potter and his wretched quartet mocking my snivelous beak still lingered in my memory. And the hygiene? I didn't maintain it partly out of apathy, but mostly because watching over this very Potter brat increased my workload to the point where I had absolutely no time for myself. And now, here was the cause of my misery, deliberately bringing it up. I hated the Potter brat because he looked exactly like his father, and his personality was equally unlikable. So now, to have the person I hated the most in the world sincerely praising me, the feeling must be as disgusting and insulting as swallowing a live toad. Listing my own flaws didn't sting much coming from my own mouth, but for the potions professor listening, he was likely on the verge of an aneurysm. I stood there, secretly delighted, waiting for the explosion. Da! He was trembling. He was actually vibrating with rage, unable to form a single syllable. His cheeks twitched furiously. The terrifying aura around him flared, and suddenly a hand shot out and seized my collar. The grip was iron tight, nearly lifting me off the ground. Before I could even feign resistance, he roughly dragged me to the threshold and hurled me out the door. "Get out! Get out!" the black-robed man finally roared. I was shoved forcefully into the cold corridor. I barely managed to stumble a few steps before losing my balance and hitting the stone floor hard. Behind me, the heavy dungeon door slammed shut with a deafening bang. I sat up, shrugged, and dusted off my robes. A look of profound satisfaction settled on my face as I began the trek back to the tower. Although the speech had been a calculated tactical strike, the opening question was genuine. Since becoming Potter, I couldn't brew potions all day, and I no longer had the burden of greasy hair. I was clean. I couldn't help but send a greeting to my former, greasier self. As I walked towards Gryffindor Tower, I deliberately took a detour past the Great Hall. I glanced at the point hourglasses. The ruby-filled glass representing Gryffindor had suffered a catastrophic hemorrhage. There was a massive, glaring empty space at the bottom of the hourglass. My satisfaction deepened. Worth it.
The next morning, the sight of the Gryffindor hourglass was a balm to my weary soul. The students passing by on their way to the Great Hall were stunned into silence, staring at the emptiness where the rubies used to be. Whatever appetite I had was improved significantly by the whispers sweeping through the hall and the dissatisfied glares directed at me one after another. It took no time at all for the rumors to spread. Harry Potter had angered Professor Snape during detention, resulting in a catastrophic loss of points. Judging by the visible void in the hourglass, it was at least 100. 100 points! While the dunderheads around me calculated how long the Quidditch team would have to work themselves to the bone to earn that back, I suppressed a smirk. Finally, an opportunity to purge Gryffindor of over 100 points in one go, and I had seized it with both hands. How could I possibly let them earn it back? Predictably, the Lions turned on their savior, distancing themselves as if I carried dragonpox. I sat isolated at one end of the Gryffindor table, flanked only by the youngest Weasley and Granger. I kept my eyelids lowered, maintaining a facade of sullen silence. To them, I looked distressed by the isolation. In reality, I was simply enjoying the peace. "Harry, don't mind them," Weasley stammered, bracing himself. Because he was sitting with me, the glare of the house was burning him too. He shifted in his seat, fidgeting like a worm on a hot stone. Pathetic. "Ron is right, Harry. We'll just speak up actively in class, get the professors to award us more points, and earn the points back. It'll be fine," Granger announced with that insufferable decisiveness. I lowered my head further, letting my shoulders tremble slightly to simulate deep depression. In truth, I was merely shuddering at the thought of her active participation. Seeing my state, Granger hesitated. Her Gryffindor curiosity, however, won out over her tact. "But Harry, what exactly did you say to make Professor Snape that angry?" Her gaze drifted toward the staff table where the man in black robes sat, my former body, my own face, looking as dark as the bottom of a cauldron, radiating an aura of absolute terror. I stole a glance at myself. Seeing the fury etched onto my own features brought me a profound secret satisfaction. Continue executing plan? Check. I twitched the corner of my mouth, crafting an expression that hovered between fear and sorrow, and murmured, "I just suddenly realized..." "Suddenly realized what?" Granger pressed. "Professor Snape is very charming." The words tasted like ash and vinegar. I felt physically ill, as if I was about to vomit my own heart out. "Professor Snape is charming?" Weasley and Granger shrieked in unison, their disbelief echoing off the stone walls. They hadn't noticed the volume of their voices. The high table fell silent. Dumbledore, and, more importantly, the man in black robes turned their attention sharply towards us. "Ha, Harry, you're not serious, are you? You're mocking the old bat." "No, I'm serious. You know, he cares about me." The surrounding Gryffindors looked at me with expressions that suggested I should be committed to St. Mungo's immediately. "You call that caring?" Weasley shouted, looking horrified to faint. Granger sat expressionless, her brain clearly short-circuiting as she tried to process the data. Finally, she took a breath. So Harry, you think Professor Snape is very, charming? And then you just told him directly?" Up at the staff table, Flitwick looked like he was ready to swoon. I arranged my face into a look of sincere, apprehensive innocence, fighting a heroic battle to keep a smirk from tearing through the mask. "During the week of detention, it was actually Professor Snape teaching me. I am very grateful to him." "You certainly didn't look grateful to me at the time." A sinister, familiar voice dripped from behind me. Weasley froze, his face draining of color as he looked tremblingly at my back. The terrifying figure was standing silently behind me, glaring down with a deathly intensity. I turned my head without surprise. "Professor Snape, I am very grateful to you, so at least let me speak what is in my heart." I clutched the corner of my robes, gripping the fabric until my knuckles turned white. My expression twisted, nearing distortion. I was using every fiber of my being to stop myself from bursting into wild, hysterical laughter.
Even so, I forced myself to look straight into those hollow black eyes, my eyes, conveying my sincere feelings. The expression on Snape's face suggested he had just been force-fed a mountain of dead flies. Gryffindor. He twisted the corner of his mouth, the words hissing out with difficulty, as if his lungs were leaking air. 50 points for publicly insulting a professor. Congratulations, Mr. Potter. Your detention will be scheduled from tonight until the end of this term. Granger's eyes went wide, but she dared not utter a single syllable of protest. The man standing over us was simply too terrifying. My reaction, however, was far more entertaining. I let my lips tremble. I made my cheek muscles twitch, crafting a look of utter heartbreak. Professor, I understand. I watched as I seemed to drown in that metaphorical mountain of flies. Even deducting points clearly brought him no relief. He glared at me, a look promising murder, before abruptly flicking his robes, turning on his heel and storming out of the hall. I immediately lowered my head, burying my face in my hands. Harry, Granger asked tentatively, likely suspecting tears. Although you think Professor Snape is great, you don't need to say it directly in the future. Look, he gets angry. You can express it through actions. I stayed buried in my hands, my shoulders shaking violently. Granger thought I was sobbing. In reality, I was laughing so hard my ribs hurt. Originally, I had just planned to humiliate myself and bleed Gryffindor dry of points in the process. But seeing my reaction, it was simply too amusing. Since becoming the Potter brat, I lost the privilege of deducting points to vent my anger, but now it seemed that trolling myself was an equally effective outlet. It killed two birds with one stone. After all, that was me. There was no need to be polite. I knew that no matter how much the man in black detested the current me, he would still protect this body. Even if I drove him to the brink of insanity when a critical situation arose, he wouldn't stand idly by. We were, after all, the closest and most familiar people in this wretched world.
From that day on, my life at Hogwarts seemed to enter hell mode. The Gryffindor dunderheads alienated me, treating me with open hostility. Meanwhile, the man in the dungeons found various creative reasons every day to deliberately deduct points from me. Every night was spent in detention processing potions ingredients. His justification was that Filch's punishments were completely insufficient to make Potter realize his errors. This led to a significant increase in the frequency with which I saw myself, only to be scolded terribly in the intervals between slicing roots and crushing beetles. It made me somewhat unhappy. Scolding people was satisfying, I knew that better than anyone, but it was decidedly unpleasant when the person being scolded was me. Weasley and Granger couldn't comfort me. They felt that my expression these days looked as if I were constantly on the verge of tears. In reality, it was just the strain of suppressing my urge to hex the entire student body. And while I was unhappy, the man in black felt satisfied. As always, he sat behind the long desk grading homework, marking a crisp T on a piece of parchment with a vicious flourish. His mood was actually not as terrible as the grade he had just given. I sat obediently to the side, processing ingredients. My movements were fast and precise. In just the 3 days that I had been coming for detention, the backlog of ingredients he, needed to prepare for classes had been more than half cleared. This saved him a lot of trouble. In his spare moments, he could still vent by mocking this face, so like James Potter, and deducting points, watching with glee as Potter couldn't curse back, but instead wore a look of suppressed anger. At least I no longer looked like an abused child to him. Small mercies. The great Mr. Potter put on a normal expression. Your current appearance makes me think you want to eat this toad? He started picking faults again, clearly in a rather good mood. As long as my expression or tone was even slightly off, he would find trouble. No, I said dryly.
Being able to help myself lighten the workload seemed necessary, practically speaking, but I really couldn't help wanting to curse back at the mockery during the process. My formidable rationality barely held my temper in check. "Professor Snape, I added with difficulty, forcing the words out, I have already tried very hard to complete the tasks you assigned." The words were almost mumbled in my throat, but I knew his hearing was sharp enough. "So, could you," I said quickly, "not be so hostile towards me?" I couldn't blow my cover, but I could continue to disgust him. Let him deduct points, let him give detentions. These things actually amused me in a twisted way. He almost laughed out of anger. In fact, the corner of his mouth did indeed twist upwards into a terrifying arc. "Hostile, Mr. Potter, do not forget that you are currently in detention. The reason is disrespect towards a professor." I looked at my own face and, imitating the most reckless manner of the young Potter, retorted defiantly, "I'm telling the truth. I really feel towards you." His cheek twitched violently, and a wave of rage suddenly surged in those black eyes. I watched his expression and wisely chose not to finish the sentence. "Very good." It seemed like a century had passed before he spoke softly. "It seems detention hasn't taught you a lesson at all. I hear those two little friends of yours have been desperately trying to earn points in various classes these days, haven't they?" I realized what was coming, and my eyes widened. "That's right." He lowered his voice silkily, his black eyes revealing undisguised malice. Being retaliated against by little Potter with those flirtatious words had thoroughly disgusted him. Now he was striking back. "For your lack of repentance, Gryffindor, 50 points." My expression immediately twisted. I clenched my fists at my sides, my whole body trembling with suppression. 50 points. I was now genuinely curious if Gryffindor's gems were in the negative. I really wanted to see Dumbledore's expression when he saw the hourglass. "Go back to processing your ingredients," he drawled, lazily trying to provoke me further. I stared desperately at the floor to adjust my facial muscles. I stared until my eyes felt dry and itchy, and only then did I manage to make myself look angry, yet restrained. It was a pity. All these deducted points would just be added back by Dumbledore at the end of the term. He had always been partial to his favorites. To prevent giving myself away, I sat down without a word and continued processing. Today's point-grinding task complete. But I noticed him suddenly tighten his grip on his quill, his lips pressed into a hard line. He was staring at me, specifically at my eyes. Because I had been staring at the floor so intensely to keep from laughing, my green eyes were covered in a thin layer of moisture. I saw his heart clench involuntarily. I could see it in the slight rigidity of his posture. Although my expression showed I was suppressing great anger, he clearly felt that I wasn't actually angry. Indeed, my eyes held none of that emotion. Instead, he likely saw a trace of being hurt from being rejected, gone in a flash. He certainly didn't think he was mistaken. Why would that foolish Potter feel hurt, he must be wondering? Because of the point deduction? Or because of my attitude? He gripped the quill so hard he almost snapped it, clearly unwilling to think about it further. Fool.
In the days that followed, the man in the dungeons finally showed some restraint, allowing the mentally and physically exhausted Gryffindors to breathe a collective sigh of relief. Dumbledore had publicly stated to Professor Snape that appropriate detention was sufficient and that there was no need for it to continue until the end of the term. I felt a twinge of regret, but I was completely unsurprised by this outcome. Setting aside Dumbledore's blatant favoritism, I had been kept in detention until very late every night. Exhausted, I would go straight to sleep, leaving me with absolutely no energy to wander the castle at night. Naturally, this meant I couldn't stumble into the trap Dumbledore had so carefully prepared for his golden boy. With every day that passed, the end of the term drew nearer. The headmaster was naturally anxious. 3 or 4 days after the detentions were canceled, I woke up to find James Potter's invisibility cloak by my bedside. There was also a note, written in a loopy handwriting I found incredibly familiar and incredibly irritating. "This is something your father left for you. Use it well." I understood immediately. The time had come, the stage was set, and the puppet was required to dance. Although I loathed the idea of sneaking around furtively in the dead of night, it reminded me too much of the Elder Potter's quartet of arrogance, I still had to participate in the plan. However, the nature of this excursion was different from the countless nights I had spent patrolling these corridors as a professor. The castle in the dead of night looked eerie, transformed by shadows. The people in the portraits were all dozing, resting their foreheads on their hands. It was a sight I was accustomed to, yet seeing it from this height, from this perspective, was jarring. My entire body was hidden beneath the invisibility cloak. I carefully controlled my breathing and my footsteps. I had to remember that I was merely a first-year student now. This was supposed to be my first time out at night. I couldn't actually be caught by a professor. Yet I couldn't move with the silent predatory grace of a spy, or it would raise suspicion. I had to carefully master the right degree of amateurish caution. I controlled myself to wander aimlessly around the castle. Sure enough, as if the castle itself were conspiring with the headmaster, the corridor changed imperceptibly, and I arrived outside an abandoned classroom. "Who is that?" An alert male voice asked softly in the distance. My heart hammered against my ribs. The person was just around the corner, preparing to walk over. I knew that voice better than anyone. I held my breath, immediately turned the doorknob, and feigned fleeing into the classroom in a panic. There were quite a few miscellaneous items piled up in the abandoned room, but the most conspicuous object was a magnificent mirror standing right in the center. The frame was ornate and ancient, with a string of letters carved in the gold edge. Uriste, Eru, Otuba, Fefru, O Tino, Woi, Shi. This was the goal for tonight, the Mirror of Arist. I murmured inwardly, analyzing the situation. Although I couldn't tell if Dumbledore was hiding in this classroom under a disillusionment charm right now, the person outside the door just moments ago was clearly myself. After noticing the telltale sign of an intruder, he surprisingly didn't immediately give chase. Instead, his footsteps vanished. This spoke volumes. I had deliberately left the door unlocked just now. Due to my keen senses, honed over 2 lifetimes, I could still faintly feel myself quietly slipping into the room and hiding in a shadowed corner. Standing there, facing the mirror, I felt a sudden, rare sense of being lost. I could replace the young Potter in killing the Dark Lord and completing the final deed, but I didn't understand. Since the young Potter had to die, who should complete the remaining tasks to ensure this time wouldn't fail again? Should I struggle to come up with another way to let the young Potter live if possible? After all, that was Lily's son. Oh, but this is my body now. It was this point that made me even more conflicted. Perhaps looking into the Mirror of Arist now to determine what I truly want to do in this strange second life might be a valid diagnostic tool. But I made my mind that no matter what I saw in the mirror later, I would lie. I would describe the scene the young Potter had seen in the original timeline. For the happiest people, the Mirror of Arist is just an ordinary mirror. For those with firm hearts, it is merely superfluous. In my last life, I always knew what I wanted. So even though I longed to see Lily again, I preferred to recall her in my memories, refusing to rely on a false reflection. So now, this was the first time Severus Snape had ever looked into the Mirror of Arist. I slowly walked forward and raised my eyes. The red-headed, green-eyed woman was smiling at me. Beside her, the familiar black-robed man wore an expression of unprecedented gentleness. They exchanged glances, their demeanor completely free of estrangement, just as we had been before the rift, before the mudblood slur, before everything went wrong. I didn't realize my breathing had suddenly quickened as I stared intently into the glass. Then Lily's figure slowly faded away. The thin, small figure of Harry Potter appeared beside the black-robed man. His green eyes showed the exact same complexity and gloom that I knew resided in my own soul. I snapped out of my daze, carefully examining the shifting image, waiting for Eris to provide an answer. The scene changed violently. The black-robed man in the mirror, me, stumbled and fell to the ground. His eyes were slowly becoming hollow, a large patch of crimson blood seeping from his neck and chest. This was clearly the scene of my death by Nagini in the Shrieking Shack. The Harry in the mirror immediately leaned down anxiously. His hands trembled as he tried to force a potion down the dying man's throat. But the man no longer swallowed, the liquid slid uselessly down his throat and disappeared into his collar. Then the Harry in the mirror did something that made the breath hitch in my throat. He gritted his teeth, drank a mouthful of the potion himself, and then leaned down and kissed the man, forcing the liquid into his mouth. I stood outside the mirror watching dumbfounded, almost forgetting to breathe. Only then did the dying man's scattered eyes slowly regain focus. In the next moment, the mirror shifted again. It showed a scene of Harry confronting Voldemort. Both simultaneously cast a green light at the other, both fell. The black-robed man, alive and whole, abruptly rushed out from the sidelines and embraced the silent boy. His calm expression shattered, leaving only unconcealed panic and despair. He tightly embraced the boy, silently uttering something over and over. Reading his lips, I recognized the name. Harry. Not Potter. Harry. After the boy weakly and slowly regained consciousness, he could only comfortingly grasp the man's hand. The two exchanged a look of tacit understanding and affection, and the image froze there. Question mark, question mark, question mark. I stared at the mirror surface with a grave expression, a cold chill running down my spine. Something was definitely strange. This was not right at all.
I watched from the corner of my eye as the man in the shadows, my former self, staggered backward a step. Even in the dim light, I could see his face turning the color of old parchment. Dumbledore cast a surprised glance at him, but he ignored the headmaster completely, his hollow eyes staring intently at the mirror of Eris, fixed on the space where my reflection had just been. I didn't stay to watch the rest. I turned and fled the room, feigning the panic of a caught first-year student, though my face was likely as gray as his. Dumbledore probably thought I looked as if my father had just died, if only he knew. I heard footsteps behind me. He was following me. I kept my head down, walking briskly back towards Gryffindor Tower. I could feel his gaze burning into my back. It wasn't his usual piercing glare of hatred. It was something heavier, something unsettled. He stared at me with a rare, visible, internal struggle, as if he wanted to strangle me but couldn't quite bring himself to reach out. He escorted me all the way to the fat lady's portrait without saying a single word. No detention, no points deducted. He just stood there, watching me scramble through the portrait hole before turning sharply and marching back towards the dungeons. It wasn't his night to patrol. He had clearly been stationed there to cooperate with Dumbledore's little trap. He just hadn't expected to see that. I lay in my four-poster bed staring at the velvet canopy. My mind raced. If he had been watching, if he had seen the reflection in the mirror of Eris shows the heart's deepest desire. If he saw Harry Potter kissing Severus Snape in that reflection, a wave of dark amusement washed over me, warring with my own lingering confusion about the vision. The next morning, breakfast in the Great Hall was a torture of its own. I sat at the Gryffindor table, feeling distracted and absent-minded. I sipped my pumpkin juice mechanically, poking the bacon on my plate into an unsightly, greasy mess. I was completely unaware of the chatter around me. Weasley and Granger were casting concerned looks my way, but I turned a deaf ear to them. My mind was still in that abandoned classroom. Subconsciously, my gaze drifted toward the high table. I locked eyes with him. He was already looking at me. His expression was a mixture of horror, disgust, and something inexplicably complex. Instinctively, falling back on the shy, introverted Potter persona I had cultivated, I immediately lowered my eyes and slightly pursed my lips. I heard a fork clatter against a plate. I risked another glance through my lashes. His face couldn't get any blacker. He looked as though he had just swallowed a bucket of raw flobber worms. He was twisting his mouth in an expression of utter revulsion, yet he didn't look away. He continued to glare at me, but the heat in his eyes was different today. It wasn't his hatred for James Potter's son. It was the panic of a man being stalked. Merlin's beard, I realized with a sudden jolt. He believes it. He believes that this Potter brat harbors a secret, twisted infatuation with his greasy, dungeon-dwelling potions master. My cheek twitched as I suppressed the urge to smirk. Dumbledore was absent from the table, likely off on some urgent business, leaving him to supervise me. He had no choice but to sit there and observe my longing expression. I watched his hand tighten around his fork until his knuckles turned white. His cheek twitched again. He clearly didn't know how to face me now. Fortunately for him, he thought I was unaware that he had seen the reflection. The only option left to him was to pretend he didn't know. I knew exactly what was going through his mind. I knew it because I was him. His first reaction to being liked by the elder Potter son was undoubtedly sheer revulsion, a nausea that made him want to vomit his breakfast. But watching the subtle shift in his eyes, I knew there was something else. I couldn't deny the humiliating truth about myself. Underneath that disgust, his heart had moved, just slightly. Why? Because when he looked at me, he was forcing himself to admit that this boy was completely unlike the elder Potter. In fact, this boy somewhat resembled himself. I could practically hear his internal rationalization, a desperate attempt to soothe his own hazy mind. Excluding the boy's actions from the past few days, the rest of his personality seems acceptable. No matter what, he was likely telling himself, it is better than an arrogant, foolish, and reckless Potter clone strutting around. It is better to be mocked. Outwardly, he continued to glare darkly at the Gryffindor table, his eyes burning into me, but inside, I knew his head was feeling somewhat hazy, haphazardly reassuring himself with these twisted justifications, trying to make peace with the impossible.
I forced myself to take a bite of the fried egg, chewing mechanically. It might as well have been cardboard. I couldn't taste anything at all. I paused, suppressing a sigh, and forced down another mouthful. My movements were stiff, my mind clouded with doubt. What on earth was wrong with him today? From the high table, the man in black kept looking over. It was natural that he hated the Potter brat. I, of all people, understood the necessity of that hatred. But today, this hostility was unmasked, raw and scorching. He was staring directly at me with a ferocity that unnerved me. Why had his attitude suddenly become so fierce? Could it be related to last night? Had I let my mask slip? Harry, what's wrong today? Didn't you sleep well? The meticulous Miss Granger asked worriedly. She had noticed my pale face and the way I was struggling to swallow my food. What's wrong with Harry? Weasley asked, blankly, looking up from a plate of hashed mutton, his mouth greasy. I managed to curve the corner of my lips slightly and shook my head, indicating I was fine. My mind was elsewhere. After returning last night, I had repeatedly pondered the scene I had witnessed in the Mirror of Arised, reaching two conclusions. First, I still wanted to save him, my former self, in the end. Second, seeing the reflection of the duel with the Dark Lord strengthened my resolve. I had to find a way to preserve this body. Potter shouldn't die, even if it was just a shell. The one who deserved to die, who needed to die, was Snape. I was already utterly exhausted, but if my rebirth was a sign that I hadn't fully atoned for my sins in the previous life, if I had failed to help Potter kill the Dark Lord properly, then in this life I would complete everything. I would live well in Potter's stead. Only after decades, when this life was over, could I finally find peace in death. Lost in these heavy thoughts, I unconsciously pursed my lips in disappointment. A fleeting expression of hurt and deep, aching loneliness crossed my face. I didn't realize I had let it show, but he did. I felt his gaze intensify. I looked up through my lashes and saw him freeze, his fork hovering mid-air. I could read his expression as easily as a potion recipe. He had caught that look of hurt. I could practically hear the hysterical monologue running through his mind. Look at him. Just by being glared at, he shows that look of wounded affection. I am not the one feeling wronged here. Why must I suffer the indignity of being liked by the elder Potter's son? He gnashed his teeth, his jawline tight with endurance. He angrily stabbed a slice of bread onto his plate, trying to distract himself. He wanted to leave. I saw his body shift, preparing to arise. But then he stopped. He couldn't leave yet. Dumbledore must have given him orders to watch me. So he continued to reluctantly stare at the Gryffindor table, his mind racing, likely cursing Dumbledore to the deepest pits of the seven hells. I couldn't stand the scrutiny any longer. I put down my fork and stood up. My expression had completely calmed down. I locked my emotions away behind my occlumency shields. "Aren't you going to eat?" Granger asked immediately. "I want to go out for a walk. I'll go myself." Seeing her prepare to follow, I preemptively cut off her next words. I saw Snape's aura at the head table suddenly turn gloomy. Is the boy playing games with me? He was undoubtedly thinking. Throwing a lover's tantrum? He glanced unhappily at the bread on his plate, barely touched, and stood up abruptly. With a swirl of black robes, he strode away from the table, ignoring the surprised whispers of the staff. I left the Great Hall and headed outside the castle, standing not far from the main entrance, gazing into the distance. The morning air was cold, biting at my skin, but it felt grounding. I stood there for a moment, knowing my back view must look solitary and desolate. It probably carried a strange sense of familiarity to the man following me. After all, how many times had I stood alone like this? I heard footsteps, then a stiff pause. He had dismissed the thought of familiarity, burying it under layers of prejudice. Mr. Potter wants to freeze himself into an ice sculpture by the front door this morning. His voice came from behind me, dripping with an ominous sneer. But I must say, this is probably the most hideous ice sculpture I've ever seen. I turned to look up at him. I made sure my eyes showed neither anger nor sadness, but rather a flash of surprise. I looked straight into his hollow black eyes, my eyes, searching for something. Then I pulled it all back. "Did you come out specifically to find me?" I asked softly. Then I added the honorific, knowing exactly how it would land. "Professor Snape?" In a flash, I saw his pupils contract. For a split second, the image of a love-struck Potter cheering up at this conjecture must have flashed before his eyes. It terrified him. Yet my statement hit on the truth. He had come specifically to find me, even if under orders, and he couldn't refute it without revealing Dumbledore's hand. "Are you suffering from delusion, Potter?" He sneered in a fit of pique, the gloomy pressure around him almost solidifying into a physical weight. He was panicking. A professor has no obligation to care about the trivial matter of why a student hasn't finished his breakfast. He threw me a look of withering mockery, then turned on his heel and strode away from the table, his robes billowing violently as he headed towards the Forbidden Forest, fleeing the conversation. I stood there, stunned for a long moment. Then a flicker of amusement danced in my eyes. This was the first time I realized that he, Severus Snape, the terror of the dungeons, would actually become reckless with his words when thoroughly embarrassed. A professor has no obligation to care why a student hasn't finished his breakfast. I almost smiled. If he wasn't constantly watching me, if he wasn't hyper-focused on my every move, how would he even know I hadn't finished my breakfast? I was absolutely certain he had followed me out for a specific reason. Now that I had guessed correctly, he wouldn't admit it, putting on a show of disdain to cover his tracks. The corner of my mouth twitched. If it weren't for the need to maintain my image, I would have burst out laughing. Indeed, teasing myself was the finest entertainment I have found in this new life.
Severus, what do you think of Harry? Dumbledore had only returned from his mysterious absence on the third day. As everyone was eating breakfast in the Great Hall that morning, he raised his goblet and asked the question, his tone seemingly casual. From my seat at the Gryffindor table, I watched the man in black closely. His mouth twisted into a familiar sneer, but before he could speak, swish! The eyes of every single professor at the staff table suddenly snapped towards them. The collective movement was so synchronized, it was almost comical. I saw him, my former self, quickly glance left and right. He clearly found his colleagues' reaction strange, but he didn't dwell on it. I knew exactly what was going through his mind. He wanted nothing more than to belittle and mock the Potter brat as he usually did. However, Albus was asking about his observation of Harry Potter after the boy had faced the mirror of Erised for the past 2 days, and he was asking in front of the entire staff. He had to be professional. He had to report the truth of the boy's character regarding the stone's protection. Potter, he began reluctantly, dragging the name out, is firm in his conviction and not easily tempted by external things. To my bewilderment, the professors quickly exchanged secret nods. I could almost hear their thoughts. Of course, to have the courage to pursue the ultra-strict, dungeon-dwelling Severus, one has to be firm in conviction. And since the boy could fall for a man with an appearance like that, it shows that Harry Potter is indeed not easily tempted by superficial beauty. He sees Severus's inner essence. Professor Sprout's eyes held a warm, motherly smile, and she nodded repeatedly. Good boy, Harry truly is a good boy. He's just a little disappointed, which is an expected reaction, he continued, unwilling to keep praising Potter, adding with a cold, derisive laugh, but, if you ask me, being dramatic for 2 days is a bit too delicate. That's not being delicate, Madam Hooch suddenly interrupted, slamming her goblet down. Before Dumbledore or even the man in black himself could process this interruption, Professor Flitwick chimed in squeakly, Exactly. Even Minerva, as stern as she was, slightly frowned and said disapprovingly, Harry is only 11, Severus. You're being a little harsh. What? Dumbledore looked utterly confused. He blinked behind his half-moon spectacles. He had only been away for 2 days. What on earth had happened to make the staff suddenly start defending Harry Potter against Severus Snape? But the person most inexplicably confused was the man in black. I watched his brow furrow. He had been present the day before yesterday and yesterday. He hadn't seen me interact with his colleagues at all. Why the sudden defense force? But Severus Snape could not possibly show Potter any kindness just because of peer pressure. So he continued to sneer silently, wearing an expression of unyielding granite. Then Professor Sprout leaned in and whispered, subtly comforting him, It's all right, take your time. Harry is only 11. Take your time. I saw the realization hit him like a bludger to the face. He reacted quickly, seeing the ambiguous, knowing, and sickeningly supportive looks in his colleagues' eyes. He was momentarily shocked into silence. Then he erupted. I don't know why you are all so idle, he said coldly, raising his voice. I and Potter have absolutely no relation. His face pale with fury, he abruptly stood up. With a violent swirl of his cape, he strode away. As he passed the Gryffindor table, he shot me a savage glare. It was a look of pure, unadulterated rage. He looked severely provoked, as if he wanted to murder me right there between the toast and the marmalade. I sat there, glared at for no apparent reason, and couldn't help but sweep my gaze towards the staff table. I met the eyes of the group of professors. My heart jumped in alarm, but before I could react, I saw them nodding encouragingly at me. Some smiled, some cast pitying glances. I was truly bewildered now. What on Merlin's name was going on? I poked the broccoli on my plate a few times with my fork, feeling a strange compulsion to go check on the explosive situation. I'm leaving first. You guys continue eating, I said, standing up hurriedly. Aren't you eating, Harry? Where are you going?
Ron asked, his mouth full of hashed mutton, completely oblivious to the social undercurrents. Hermione, however, had been paying close attention to the drama at the high table. She looked at me with eyes full of thoughtful concern. Professor Snape looks very unhappy and didn't eat much either, she instructed me seriously. Harry, why don't you take some food over? To better demonstrate my thoughtfulness, of course. I paused for a moment, weighing the absurdity of the situation against my desire to see what was happening. Obediently, I reached out and took 2 sandwiches. I'll do that, I mumbled, and left the hall. Behind me, Hermione looked at her own breakfast and sighed heavily, her appetite gone. What's wrong, Hermione? Ron asked, puzzled, waving a sausage. All you do is eat. You don't care about Harry. Seeing him enjoy his food so much, Hermione felt angry on my behalf. Professor Snape clearly hates Harry, and Harry still likes him. Professor Snape is angry right now, she continued despairingly. If Harry goes over, he's sure to be scolded again. How sad that must make him, but I can't persuade him not to court disaster. So even now, I still can't believe Harry would actually fall for the old bat? Ron swallowed his food and muttered under his breath. I'm surprised too, Hermione admitted softly, but since Harry likes him, we have to help him, don't we?
As soon as the man in black left the Great Hall, he headed straight for the dungeons. I had not been mistaken in my prediction. I knew his habits, his stride, and his destination. After jogging for a few minutes, I caught up with the figure billowing down the corridor. "Professor Snape, wait!" I shouted. The black-robed man stopped abruptly. He turned around with a gloomy expression, his eyes narrowing. Potter, obstructing a professor without reason. 5 points from Gryffindor. I didn't change my expression at all. I didn't flinch at the deduction. I was used to it. Instead, I held up the wrapped napkins in my hand and said sincerely, "Professor, I brought you a sandwich. You didn't eat much just now." His face grew even darker. "My affairs are none of your concern," he said coldly. I could see exactly why he was reacting this way. It was precisely because he noticed the sincere tone in my voice. He realized that this boy was genuinely worried he hadn't eaten properly. I could practically hear the thoughts screaming in his head. He was recalling the cryptic, understanding, and ambiguous expressions of his colleagues at breakfast. He was remembering my undisguised words of affection from the other day. His stomach was likely aching with rage, and he desperately wanted to savagely deduct points to vent his frustration. That is the elder Potter's son. That is Lily's son. Even setting those 2 points aside, the boy standing in front of him was only 11 years old. Did no one else find this improper? And the object of this affection was him, an ugly, sullen, and boring old bat. Had the entire world lost their mind? I know, I admitted readily to his... As soon as the man in black left the Great Hall, he headed straight for the dungeons. I had not been mistaken in my prediction. I knew his habits, his stride, and his destination. After jogging for a few minutes, I caught up with the figure billowing down the corridor. "Professor Snape, wait!" I shouted. The black-robed man stopped abruptly. He turned around with a gloomy expression, his eyes narrowing. "Potter, obstructing a professor without reason, 5 points from Gryffindor." I didn't change my expression at all. I didn't flinch at the deduction. I was used to it. Instead, I held up the wrapped napkins in my hand and said sincerely, "Professor, I brought you a sandwich. You didn't eat much just now." His face grew even darker. "My affairs are none of your concern," he said coldly. I could see exactly why he was reacting this way. It was precisely because he noticed the sincere tone in my voice. He realized that this boy was genuinely worried he hadn't eaten properly. I could practically hear the thoughts screaming in his head. He was recalling the cryptic, understanding, and ambiguous expressions of his colleagues at breakfast. He was remembering my undisguised words of affection from the other day. His stomach was likely aching with rage, and he desperately wanted to savagely deduct points to vent his frustration. That is the elder Potter's son. That is Lily's son. Even setting those 2 points aside, the boy standing in front of him was only 11 years old. Did no one else find this improper? And the object of this affection was him, an ugly, sullen, and boring old bat. Had the entire world lost its mind?
I know, I admitted readily to his rebuff. In any case, I stepped forward, my expression unchanged, and slipped the wrapped sandwich directly into his hand, seeming completely unaware of how audacious the action was. Going to class without eating breakfast is tough to endure. Professor, you aren't particularly busy this morning, so please eat something. There was a genuine note of reflection in my tone. I remembered, when I was Snape in the past, the reason my body had become so terrible was partially due to self-neglect, but largely due to being too busy. I didn't have time to eat, sleep, or rest. When I felt unwell, I simply endured it in class, maintaining a stern facade while my body screamed in protest. But that didn't mean I didn't feel bad. I wasn't made of iron. Therefore, when there was time to eat, one shouldn't skip a meal because of some fleeting emotion. Now that I was Harry Potter, I ate and slept well every day. Looking at myself still trapped in that cycle of self-destruction, I couldn't help but advise him further. For this purpose, I had even deliberately ignored the reason for his anger just now. I didn't mention the rumors or the awkwardness. I just wanted him to listen to the advice for a moment. He gripped the still warm food that had been thrust into his hand. He looked down at it, then up at those green eyes staring sincerely at him. The combination of that genuine concern and that abhorrent face belonging to James Potter, I saw an inexplicable wave of melancholy and frustration clog his throat. 100 mixed feelings warred behind his black eyes. For a moment, he actually snarled, a cold, defensive sound. "Mr. Potter, if there's nothing wrong with your ears, you should know I have already said, mind your own business. That is enough." He had made a decision. He just needed to restore our relationship to how it used to be, then he wouldn't have this headache. He could freely detest the young Potter, and the young Potter only needed to detest him in return. No other feelings were necessary. He sneered mockingly, just as he used to in my old memories, his black eyes filled with undisguised malice. Then, contemptuously, he opened his hand. Splat! The 2 sandwiches fell, hitting the stone floor heavily. The bread split open and the cheese and meat slices scattered messily across the dirty ground. It looked as if what had shattered into pieces wasn't just lunch, but the boy's loving heart. I looked at the mess on the ground expressionless. Then I raised my head and cast a deep, lingering glance at him. I didn't say a word. I simply turned and walked away. I didn't need to look back to know that he watched my figure disappear around the corner with a gloomy face. I knew he would abruptly turn around and stride away, pretending nothing had happened. But I also knew him better than he knew himself. Contrary to what he had expected, even though our relationship had finally returned to the correct state of mutual detestation, he wouldn't feel any sense of relief. On the contrary, that deep glance I had given him, it would make him feel slightly breathless. A sense of bitterness would be welling up in his heart right now. "This is absolutely ridiculous," he would be thinking. I could picture it perfectly. He would push open the dungeon door and walk in. He would tap his wand on the table, and a house elf would immediately appear with a crack, bowing respectfully. "Professor Snape, what do you require?" Is he still expecting something? Does he think the elder Potter's son actually likes him? He would sneer mockingly at his own weakness, but his mouth, as if possessed by a will of its own, would betray him. "Just 2 cheese sandwiches." "Understood. Wait. Just as he snapped back to his senses, wanting to change the order to something less specific, the house elf had already agreed and vanished. And so, Severus Snape would be left sitting in his dark office, staring at the fresh sandwiches brought to him, his face as black as the bottom of a cauldron, remaining silent for a very, very long time.
Since that day, the rumors of Harry Potter harboring a secret crush on Professor Snape had hit a wall of ice. I hadn't shown even the slightest trace of affection again. The man in the dungeon was the same. As soon as he saw me, he would put on a gloomy face, pick faults, and deduct points, maintaining a contemptuous and disdainful appearance. To any outside observer, we looked like sworn enemies, with absolutely no bad blood between us other than the standard Gryffindor-Slytherin animosity.
So, Harry, what exactly happened that day? We can only help you if you tell us, Granger asked cautiously, her brow furrowed. Yeah, Harry. Weasley looked at me with similar concern. Ever since I had come back empty-handed from the corridor that day, my expression had been gloomier than ever before. When they asked me anything, I would only sit alone, silent and withdrawn. Granger clearly thought I was utterly heartbroken. She wanted to cheer me up, but didn't know where to start. Why pick anyone to like but Professor Snape? I could practically hear her thoughts. It wasn't that Professor Snape was necessarily bad, but his personality was simply unlikable, especially since the man was currently furious. Granger could foresee the consequences of Harry chasing after him, which is why she instantly regretted her earlier suggestion. Being severely scolded by the person you liked was unbearable, and it wasn't the first time I had been targeted. Now it was time for potions class again. We arrived early, the golden trio taking our seats at the front. The Slytherins were already seated, looking smug, while Gryffindor students were still trickling in. I looked at my two worried friends, shook my head, and answered with a flat expression. I'm fine. You don't need to worry. I was indeed conflicted these days, but it had absolutely nothing to do with being utterly heartbroken, as they foolishly thought. Having good intentions tossed aside like trash, contemptuously smashed onto the stone floor right in front of me, even if that was my former self doing the smashing, I couldn't swallow that insult. Who was I? I was the head of Slytherin House. I was Severus Snape. He, that arrogant version of myself, just needed to wait. This was definitely not over. However, I had run the calculations. If I argued back directly, it would only give him a reason to deduct points. The most advantageous revenge would still be the disgusting method I'd utilized before, flirting. But grossing out Professor Snape meant grossing out myself. My anger hadn't subsided yet, and I really didn't want to praise and compliment him right now. I decided to wait a while before deploying that nuclear option. So, what should I do now? Perhaps go fight the Dark Lord. Although it wasn't the end of the term yet, I didn't need to strictly adhere to my previous life's timeline. I would roughly follow the process, attract Quirrell's attention, and lead him to the trapdoor. Whatever happened after that wouldn't be up to Quirrell. I was lost in these dark thoughts when I heard a smooth, silky voice ring out beside my ear. I hear Mr. Potter has become very famous recently. Does that mean you no longer pay attention to professors? I looked up. Professor Snape had silently entered the classroom and was standing directly in front of me, adopting his familiar, looming, fault-finding stance. As if to fully demonstrate his oppressive aura, the black-robed man lowered his head, moving uncomfortably close to my face. I could clearly see my own reflection in those bottomless black eyes. But I regret to inform you, he said methodically, in my classroom, the name Mr. Potter is completely useless. He straightened up, looking down his nose at me. He announced it in a lazy, satisfied tone. The Slytherins immediately burst into a chorus of jeering laughter, led by Malfoy, who laughed the loudest. The Gryffindors glared back with angry looks. Weasley started to stand up in indignation to defend me, but Granger quickly grabbed his arm, pulling him down. He is deliberately targeting Harry, Weasley whispered furiously. That old bat, even though Harry still likes him. He frowned, wanting to say more, but Granger quickly made a shh gesture. She saw Professor Snape's eyes still glancing over here. Don't let him catch another flaw, her eyes said. Since speaking now is useless, we need to go back and slowly think of a strategy. I noticed his gaze too. From the moment of the point deduction, I put on an expressionless face. I watched him silently, ensuring there was absolutely no emotion in my eyes. I conveyed only that I calmly accepted the punishment. You just want to see me angry. You want to find fault and provoke me into angrily confronting you so you can continue to vent your frustration and deduct points. I refuse to be angry. I will calmly accept whatever you say. I will endure you, and I will let you stifle on that unreleased anger. Once this period is over, then it will be my turn to vent.
But the man standing over me was unaware of my inner tactical analysis. Under the gaze of my calm eyes, which held not a single ripple of defiance, I saw his falter. He couldn't continue picking faults if there was no reaction. His eyes flickered. His face still showed a gloomy expression of disgust, and his imposing manner remained intact. But I knew his mind was recalling the look I had given him before leaving the corridor the other day. He was involuntarily losing his nerve. He knew he was in the wrong. Although his self-image was a disgraced Death Eater, a gloomy, annoying old bat, even he wasn't so obtuse as to be unable to distinguish good intentions. After biting the bullet and drawing a line in the sand with the young Potter, he thought he could finally detest the boy without any psychological burden. But why was it that Potter wouldn't fight back when hit? Why wouldn't he talk back when scolded? Why did he only watch him with that slightly mournful, calm gaze the whole time? He had treated the boy with such contempt, and yet, based on what Weasley had just whispered, did that boy still like him? I saw his eyes change. An inexplicable emotion was brewing in his heart. Guilt, confusion, and a terrified sort of softening. On the surface, he turned away and started gloomily explaining the potion for the lesson. He prowled the room, looking into cauldrons. Among the Slytherins, only Malfoy's performance was acceptable. Among the Gryffindors, Granger's was barely passable. But when he came to my cauldron, he paused. The quality of the potion made by Harry Potter was perfect. The technique and timing were experienced, precise, flawless. I looked up, meeting his gaze intently. I listened carefully to his lecture, acting as if the earlier incident hadn't even happened. My attitude was perfect. I saw the conflict in his eyes. Even that face, so much like the elder Potters, didn't look so hateful to him in this moment. Wait, I could practically hear his mental brake screeching. Why am I thinking about the young Potter again? This wouldn't do. He looked away sharply, desperate for a distraction. Maybe I should just continue thinking about Malfoy's grades. If not, thinking about Granger's grades would do. Anything but him. Deep lines creased his brow. I watched him rub his temples, clearly suffering from a profound, self-inflicted headache.
Follow the next parts in my playlist.